Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the monthly meeting of DDU Hospital. And this is a halfway mark in our tenure of AOGD. And we have been able to achieve much of the things which we wanted to do during this tenure, like starting a PG forum, having outreach activities in form of public forums, and training of members. So QI committee has been training, and endoscopy committee through their webinars is doing a very good job in training people in basic endoscopy, and other subcommittees are also doing very good work. And all this has been possible because of cooperation from you all. And now, since we have our annual conference coming up in November, I again want cooperation of everybody so that this conference, which I hear is being looked upon by nationally by everybody, that AOGD is going to have a big conference and people want to be part of it. So we all must make it really grand. And let's hope maybe inauguration part, I'm thinking we may be able to do physical, though I don't promise, but let's see how things are. But the whole 3-day conference won't be physical, but maybe the inauguration and followed by tea or dinner, something can be done, physical. That is in the pipeline. And in this conference, as you all must have received the notification, has a huge pre and post conference workshops, which very good workshop that there is a quiz for PGs, and we have on the lighter side a talent hunt, which Monica will tell in her report, in which you can show your hidden talents. And so I hope we will have a nice conference with cooperation from you all. And now I give over to Dr. Monica to give the secretary's report.
Thank you, ma'am. Let me just share the screen. So, good evening, one and all. Now we'll be presenting the secretary report for the month of September. Practically, events which are held between the last clinical meeting and this one. So we start our event report with the last AOGD clinical monthly meeting, which was held on 3rd of September in RV Hospital and RNR. It was a very nicely attended meeting, and very interesting cases were discussed there. Then we had, in this season, first of its kind, an offline event, which was our symposium, which was held on 18th of September on prevention and management update in postpartum hemorrhage. And it was again a well-attended symposium, and we had a guest speaker as our past Secretary General FOGSI, Dr. Jaydeep Tank. Then our AFGD Fetal Medicine and Genetics Subcommittee had a program on fetal anomalies workshop, meeting the expectation on 10th of September. Then our AOGD Infertility Committee had 2 programs under its aegis. One was Bursting the Myths and Realities in Recurrent Pregnancy Loss by FOGSI Food and Drug Committee on 8th of September. And the other one was The Truth About Thyroid by Vivio on 15th of September. Then we had a very interesting and innovative new kind of webinar on birthing experience, which was really appreciated by everybody on 16th of September by Safe Motherhood Subcommittee. Then our Quality Improvement Subcommittee did a program on decoding the basics of prenatal screening with all the branches of DGF across Delhi on 17th of September. And our multidisciplinary subcommittee did a event on critical period after delivery in association with DGF Southwest on 20th of September. Our endoscopy subcommittee did a very well attended, appreciated, and a very interesting webinar on safe laparoscopic surgery, simple solutions to avoid complex problems. It went on for quite some time, and there was a nice attendance in this, which was just yesterday on 23rd of September. And we had two programs under the Aegis AOGD. One was done by Society of Midlife Management, Meaningful Life Management on contraception on 14 September. And the other one was done by AIMS in association with Foxy Urogyney Subcommittee on Menopause Pause to Life on 21st September. We also did the continuum of our public forums, which we have been doing every month. And this month one was on vaginal discharge in women on 4th of September in association with the Delhi Gynae Forum and the WOW NGO. And the other one was with Rufaida College of Nursing, Jamia Hamdard, on adolescent health awareness. Then as far as our academic contribution is concerned, this month's bulletin was dedicated to the topic of urogynecology, and based on which we'll be having an interesting quiz, which is about to follow the clinical meeting. Amongst the forthcoming events, we have quite a big lineup of events in September and October till the next clinical meeting. So first one being endometrial cancer and surgical treatment and beyond, which will be organized by University College of Medical Sciences and GTB Hospital. Adolescent counseling on nutrition and menstrual hygiene by a rural health subcommittee, and this will also be an offline event on 27th of September. Then we have heart diseases in pregnancy. This is an AOGD webinar per se with Foxy Medical Disorder Committee on 28th September. Teenage pregnancy and anemia, again a program by adolescent health subcommittee on 29th September. A program on male infertility by Foxy Sexual Medicine Committee under the aegis of AOGD Infertility Committee on 30th September. Then hyperglycemia in pregnancy, preconceptional care and screening. This is a series of, this is the first module of a series of program dedicated to diabetes by Safe Motherhood Subcommittee on 1st October. Conservative management of pelvic organ prolapse and urinary incontinence by Urogyney Subcommittee on 2nd October. Then we have another AOGD program on PPH preparedness, road to maternal safety on 5th of October. Endometriosis and infertility by Endometriosis Subcommittee on 8th of October. Pre-implantation genetic testing, what an obstetrician should know by Fetal Medicine and Genetics Subcommittee on 8th October. Then we have luteal phase defect program by AOGD per se on 16th October. Fertility preservation theme program by Adolescent Subcommittee with DGF Southwest on 21st October. And before the last program before next meeting would be tubal corrective surgeries, the use of endoscopy by Endoscopy Subcommittee on 28th of October. And then of course we meet again in the next monthly clinical meeting, which will be held in ESI Hospital on 29th of October. Having said that, we are going to start a new program under AOGD, which will be the hands-on practical workshop, dedicated workshop for 3 hours on obstetric critical care from October onwards. And all the members who are interested for this workshop can contact our office secretary, Sarita, and her mobile number is on your screens. And this information has already been circulated through our AOGD bulletin as well. And last but not the least, we urge and welcome you all to our annual conference, and as which will be held on 19th to 21st of November 2021, preceded and succeeded by interesting dedicated workshops. And as Dr. Achla has already apprised you, we're introducing a new kind of thing with this conference this year, which will be the talent show. So anybody is welcome, any AOGD member, yoga or senior is welcome, who has the talent in dance, singing, playing any instrument or any other hidden talent, mimicry, poetry, anything, anyone is welcome. And your entries are all welcome on a special, we are circulating it through all our members. They can be sent on a dedicated email address, and all the instructions will subsequently follow. So this is all what I had to say in the report today. Thank you all.
Thank you, Monica. And now I welcome Dr. Monica and her team to start the monthly clinical proceedings. Please unmute yourself, Monica. Monica, you are muted.
This is for Dr.
Monica from DDU Hospital.
Yeah.
Yeah, Monica Square.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. I, Dr. Monica Suri Grover, HOD Ops and Gynae Deen Dayal Upadhyaya Hospital, extend a warm welcome to all of you attending the clinical meeting for the month of September 2021 under the aegis of AOGD. I am sure that the session will prove to be a learning experience for all the members attending this clinical meet. I request you all to keep your questions and comments till the end for all the presentations. In this clinical meeting, we will be covering three topics. The first topic will be on clinical profile of COVID positive obstetric patients admitted during the two waves of COVID-19. It will be presented by Dr. Ritu, who is the senior specialist in our hospital. The next case will be a rare case of pyoperitoneum in term pregnancy, and it will be presented by Dr. Harvinder, who is a specialist in our hospital. Third one will be a level of PSA in PCOS patients. It will be presented by Dr. Pankti, who is our DNB and now SR. And later on, the discussion will be by Dr. Shashi, who is a senior specialist. Now, without taking much of your time, I request Dr. Ritu to proceed with the first presentation. The screen is visible.
Thank you, Dr. Monica. Good afternoon, everyone, respected seniors, colleagues, friends, and my dear juniors. I am here to present our experience on the clinical profile of obstetric patients admitted to our hospital during the two waves of COVID-19. We all know SARS-CoV-2 virus was first identified in Wuhan, China in December 2019, and the first case in India was detected on 30th January 2020 in Kerala in medical students who had returned from Wuhan. There have been several waves of this pandemic across the globe. These waves have been of various time duration and intensity. As we can see, by the end of December 2020, United States was struggling with its third wave, whereas other nations like Russia, Brazil, France, UK, they were seeing their second wave. And at that point of time, India was seeing the descent of its first wave. India, as we all know, also witnessed two waves sweeping the entire nation. The first one was from July to December 2020, and the second one from March to May 2021. During the first wave, at the peak, approximately 90,000 cases were reported for 24-hour period, whereas this number rose to 4 lakh cases every day in the second wave. As per WHO, the strain involved in the first wave in COVID-19 in India was N440K, whereas in the second wave, the strain had mutated and B1.617.2, later renamed as Delta, constituted about 80% of the cases. The rest of the cases were majorly constituted by B1.617.1, that is the Kappa strain. As of 17th August 2021, India has the second highest number of confirmed cases in the world, second only to US, approximately 32.2 million reported cases, and third highest number of COVID deaths after US and Brazil, that is 4,32,079. Now, a brief overview of COVID-19 in pregnancy. More than 2/3 of the pregnant females with COVID remain asymptomatic. In June 2020, CDC reported that the need for hospitalization with COVID-19 occurred in 31.5% of pregnant females as compared with 5.8% in non-pregnant ones. Severe and critical illness has been described in pregnancy. Adverse pregnancy outcomes such as abortions, preterm birth, preeclampsia are higher in women with SARS-CoV-2 infection during pregnancy. Viral pneumonia is the most dreaded complication. The vertical transmission of this disease is rare and there are no increased congenital anomalies. The risk factors for the same are Black, Asian, or other minority ethnicity. A BMI of 30 or more poses a major risk factor. Pre-pregnancy state of diabetes or hypertension. Maternal age of 35 years or older. And occupational exposure, as in people who are more predisposed to contracting COVID by virtue of their occupation, for example, the healthcare workers. As can be seen, the second wave peak was more than double the previous one. In words of Mr. Zarir Udbadia of Hinduja Hospital, Mumbai, the second wave made the first one look like a ripple in a bathtub. The second wave had startling intensity with massively increased oxygen requirement, ICU admissions, and mortality. The cases of breathlessness mounted in an unprecedented manner due to the more infectious variant, wherein if one person in the family had COVID, everyone in the family would have it. This prompted us to undertake this study to see how COVID affected our pregnant patients in the two waves. We did a retrospective data collection of the COVID positive obstetric patients during each wave and thereby followed by statistical analysis of the same. During the first wave, 45 patients were admitted to our hospital, and during the second wave, 46 patients with COVID were admitted. As we can see, the age group that was most affected in both the waves was 25 to 30. This remained unchanged across both the waves, and the group least affected was that of more than 35 years. In both the waves, multigravidas were affected more than primigravidas. The virus showed no predilection for any obstetric score. Though the earlier data in Western studies suggested that people with A-type blood group were more susceptible to COVID, while those with O-type were less so, but on the contrary, we found that the B-type blood group was affected the most, and this was followed by O. A came next, followed by AB. This is a pie chart of the same. This green is the B blood group, which is occupying the maximum place. An analysis of the presenting complaints of the patients revealed that in the first wave, 71.1% of the pregnant patients were asymptomatic for COVID, whereas this number reduced to 36.9% in the second wave. This was statistically found to be very significant. Cough was the most common COVID symptom in both the waves. Significantly higher number of patients presented with fever in the second wave. And shortness of breath was one respiratory symptom in second wave, which was absent in the first. In the first wave, none of our patients required ICU admission, whereas in the second wave, 23.9%, that is 11 out of 46 patients required so. This was a very significant observation. As regards the period of gestation, maximum patients in both the waves were in the third trimester. Another observation noted was an increasing number of patients presenting early in the second trimester in the second wave. The p-value for this was 0.06, which was close to, but not statistically significant though. In both the waves, vaginal deliveries exceeded the number of cesarean sections. This one in red is the normal vaginal delivery, and this is more than the number of cesareans, which are in yellow. Hypertensive disorders of pregnancy were the most common comorbidity in the second wave, and this was found statistically significant too. Cases of associated diabetes mellitus and gestational diabetes were higher too. Another finding was significantly higher number of previous cesarean cases in the second wave. No statistically significant difference was observed between the two waves in fetal outcome, though the number of preterm babies was higher in the second wave. In contrast to wave 1, where all our patients recovered, we lost 10 patients to COVID-19 in wave 2. I hereby conclude by saying that the second wave was indeed more virulent than the previous one, requiring more ICU admissions, more oxygen, and resulting in much increased mortality. As the fear of third wave looms, we must continue to follow COVID-appropriate behavior and keep ourselves and everyone around us safe. Also, we should counsel all our pregnant females to get vaccinated. I would like to end by thanking all the COVID warriors involved in the battle against COVID. Thank you all for your patient hearing. I now invite Dr. Harvinder for a very rare case of pyoperitoneum in term pregnancy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ritu. Good afternoon, respected seniors, my dear friends, and my juniors. I am hereby presenting a rare case of pyoperitoneum in term pregnancy. A 24-year-old primary gravida with 39 weeks of gestation came with pain abdomen for 1 day, which was dull aching, non-radiating, associated with constipation. Patient had similar episode of pain abdomen off and on in the past 1 month. She was perceiving normal fetal movement. No other significant positive history was there. It was a spontaneous conception after 3 years of marriage. There is no history of tuberculosis in self or any of the family members. Patient was afebrile to touch with a pulse rate of 110 per minute, and systemic examination was normal. On abdominal examination, there was slight fullness in the epigastric region. Tenderness was present. Uterus was term size, contour well made out. A single live fetus in cephalic presentation was there. On admission, all the investigation were normal. Even the ultrasound saw no collection, only few prominent bowel loops. After admission, the patient had fever of 101 degree. Along with that, 3 to 4 episodes of vomiting. For the pain abdomen, the surgery opinion was taken, on which no abnormality was detected. The patient went into spontaneous labor and she was monitored. But later on, decision for LSCS was taken in view of known progress of labor. After opening the abdomen, the pus was pouring out. Approximately 1.5 liter of pus was drained. And then a cesarean was done. Baby boy of 2.1 kg was delivered. The uterus closed in layer. Tubes and ovaries were normal. Surgeons were called for exploration. No perforation was seen, either in small bowel or large bowel. All solid organ found to be intact. Omentum and lymph node biopsy was taken. Samples sent for AFB, histopath, culture, and CBNAT. Wash was given and abdomen closed in layers. In the post-operative period, patient continued to have fever. The investigation for fever were negative. All cultures were sterile. Even the pus for AFB was negative. Pus for CBNAT and sputum was negative. The only significant finding was opacification in the left upper lobe of chest axis suggestive of old healed lesion. Patient continued to have fever in the post-operative period. So a decision for empirically starting the ATT was taken after consulting the chest physician. The fever responded after 7 days of ATT. Meanwhile, the histopathology report came, which shows necrotizing granulomatous lesion, which was positive for AFP. Now, coming to the discussion, the pyoperitoneum can be primary or secondary. In primary, there is inflammation of the peritoneum by extraperitoneal source, which is most commonly due to coliforms or sometimes due to Mycobacterium TB. There is inflammation or mechanical breach of integrity of intestine, urogenital, or solid organ in cases of secondary pyoperitoneum. It is most commonly seen in the cases of perforation peritonitis, which is seen in typhoid fever, appendix rupture, or diverticulitis. In women of reproductive age group, ascending infection is quite common, leading to TO abscess, which sometimes may rupture, causing secondary pyoperitoneum. Tuberculosis is a major public challenge. Approximately 10 million people fell ill with tuberculosis, and India accounts for more than a quarter of the world's TB burden. It is the most infectious killer in the world. TB is a notifiable disease, and Government of India committed to end TB by the year 2025. Women of reproductive age group face a substantial burden. Many infected women are diagnosed during pregnancy. Some become pregnant during ATT, and most importantly, a significant proportion remain undiagnosed and suffer worse perinatal and maternal consequences. The exact prevalence of TB in pregnancy is unknown due to many confounding factors. India contributes to nearly 21% of the global burden of TB among pregnant women. Active tuberculosis can have adverse effect on the maternal and the perinatal. The woman without TB has in comparison to the woman without TB, there is increased risk of maternal anemia, cesareans, preterm birth, low birth weight as compared to the woman with TB. Pregnancy being an immunosuppressive condition, there is a suppression of cellular immune response. So it masks the effects and symptoms of TB. Moreover, the risk of reactivation is more. Though the TB is an ancient disease known since Hippocrates' time, but still we are facing challenges in diagnosis, especially in pregnancy. Due to non-specific nature of clinical symptoms, loss of weight is usually compensated by pregnancy gain. ESR is already raised in pregnancy. Delay in utilizing investigating modalities like CT and X-rays. When it's come to abdominal TB, the challenge is even more as the clinical presentation is subtle and the bacilli show low yield on microscopy. So the diagnosis is often delayed. A high index of suspicion is required to diagnose abdominal TB. WHO recommends all pregnant women should be screened during their antenatal checkups. Women should be asked for cough more than 2 weeks, fever more than 2 weeks, inadequate weight gain or weight loss in the last 3 months, or night sweats for the pulmonary TB, or any swelling in the body or lymph node swelling for the extrapulmonary TB. Acceptable method for microbiological diagnosis are smear microscopy. It is most commonly used but has a limited sensitivity. Culture is more sensitive and specific but requires 6 to 8 weeks. So not very helpful in early diagnosis. The PCR-based tests provide rapid tests and more accurate reports. It also provides the information regarding the drug sensitivity. Liquid cultures and CB-NATs are preferred for the cases of extrapulmonary TB. Other tests which can support the diagnosis are radiology, cytology, histopathology, and biochemistry. The use of serological tests for the diagnosis of TB has been banned. Abdominal TB is rarely encountered in pregnancy, as infertility is the commonest sign if it involves genitalia or peritoneum. Only few cases of tubercular peritonitis are reported in literature. No case report with pyoperitoneum due to TB in pregnancy has been reported so far. In a retrospective analysis of 28 cases of TB in pregnant women, only 1 woman had abdominal TB. Another case report by Fatima et al. A 37-year-old woman pregnant women presented with abdominal pain at 23 weeks of gestation, and the diagnosis was made by laparoscopic biopsy. This is another case report which was diagnosed at 22 weeks of gestation, where the laparoscopy showed the yellow-white nodule on the peritoneal surface and biopsy demonstrate caseous necrotic granuloma. This is another case report of tuberculous peritonitis in pregnancy. Once the diagnosis is made, early treatment should be started as there is increased risk of obstetric and perinatal complication. The disease may disseminate and progress to more severe form, which will be difficult to treat at later stage. Contagious patients who are left untreated can infect others in the community. Standard treatment regime with usual clinical follow-up is used. Delivery should be conducted at a hospital with extensive support. Cesarean is indicated only if it is a maternal or a fetal indication. Placenta should be sent for histopathology and microbiology. Breastfeeding should be continued. And the patient should be registered under NICSHE, and they are provided rupees 500 per month for the nutritional support. All anti-tubercular, first-line anti-tubercular drugs are safe, except streptomycin. The safety profile of second-line drugs is not known. After the decades of discovery of rifampicin, two latest drugs has been approved by the CDSCO for MDR TB, bedoqueline and delamanine. Standard therapeutic regime is used as used in general population with respect to dose and composition. HRZD is used in the intensive phase, followed by HRE for the continuous phase. The duration of the continuous phase may vary depending upon the discretion of the clinician. Till 2016, thrice weekly regime was used, but because of the increased relapse rate, it has been shifted to daily treatment directly under supervision. Fixed drug combination is used as per the weight band category. As we all know, the advantage of FDC are increased patient acceptance, increased health worker compliance, and decreased risk of emergence of drug resistance. Just a word, with the advancing era, we may encounter the pregnant patient with drug-resistant TB. So, as the clinical experience is less and the paucity of literature, the pregnant woman with drug-resistant TB less than 20 weeks should be advised MTP. But if the patient is not willing for MTP or the duration is more than 20 weeks, you should be explained about the risk to mother and the fetus and started on longer oral drug-resistant regimen. Just to conclude, diagnosis of TB in pregnancy warrants a high index of suspicion. Extreme vigilance should be used when dealing with non-specific and unexplained abdominal symptoms. In case of pyoperitoneum, if no obvious surgical cause found, tissue biopsy should be taken to increase the chance of diagnosis. Offering early diagnosis and prompt treatment ensures better maternal and neonatal outcomes. Thank you all for patient hearing. Now I invite Dr. Pankti for presentation on the marker of PCOS.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today we would be talking about the level of serum prostate specific antigen and polycystic ovarian syndrome. Polycystic ovarian syndrome was discovered by American gynecologist Stein and Leventhal in 1935 and hence was called the Stein-Leventhal syndrome in past. It is the most common cause of secondary amenorrhea. This is a diagnostic criteria for PCOS which was given by 3 different groups. Rotterdam 2003 criteria is the one which is most and currently used, which includes oligo or anovulation, clinical and biochemical signs of hyperandrogenism, polycystic ovarian morphology on ultrasound. 2 of the 3 criteria should be satisfied to label a patient as polycystic ovarian syndrome. Prostate-specific antigen, it is a glycoprotein which is expressed by both normal and neoplastic prostate tissue. It is produced under the regulation of the stimulatory effects of androgens, progestins, glucocorticoids, inhibitory effects of estrogens. The active prostate-specific antigen, it can undergo proteolysis to generate the active PSA, of which a small protein then enters the blood stream and circulates in an unbound state called free prostate-specific antigen. Active prostate-specific antigen then binds to protease inhibitors including alpha-1 antichymotrypsin and alpha-2 microalbumin. PSA has also been detected in some female tissue such as breast, ovarian, endometrial tissue, amniotic fluid, and milk. PSA production seems to be associated by steroid hormones such as androgens, progestin, and glucocorticoid. It is used as a highly specific and a valuable marker for screening, diagnosis, and monitoring of prostatic adenocarcinoma. Recent development of ultrasensitive assays demonstrated PSA in a wide variety of female tissues and fluids such as the ovary, breast, amniotic fluid, and milk. PSA expression in females is stimulated by androgens and progestin. Levels increase in women with androgen excess. Androgens are thought to upregulate the PSA gene in certain tissues, leading to increased production of PSA. Since PCOS is the most common cause of hyperandrogenism in females, PSA has been suggested as a marker for the same. The present study was taken up to evaluate the serum PSA levels in patients with PCOS. The objective of our study was to evaluate the level of serum PSA levels in patients with PCOS and to correlate the symptoms of PCOS with the levels of serum total PSA levels and other hormones and ultrasound findings. The cases were taken as polycystic ovarian syndrome, which were diagnosed by Rotterdam 2003 criteria, and controls were student and staff with normal ovaries on ultrasound and regular menstrual cycle. Written and verbal consent was obtained from all study participants. Exclusion criteria included adrenal enzyme defects like androgen secreting adrenal and ovarian tumors, Cushing syndrome, hyperprolactinemia, thyroid dysfunction, and idiopathic hirsutism were excluded from our cases. Complete history and detailed systemic examination was done. Presenting symptoms and detailed menstrual history was taken. Ultrasound was done thereafter. Blood sample was collected early in the morning following a 12-hour overnight fasting for determination of serum PSA level, FSH, LH, testosterone, DHEAS, prolactin, and TSH. 3 ml of venous sample was collected in a serum vial. Sample was processed within an hour of collection and hormones were measured. This is a demographic and clinical parameter of study subjects, including the age and years, age of menarche, BMI, waist circumference, and waist to hip ratio. Hormonal parameters of study subjects showing the prostate-specific level and controls in the PCOS group was almost same, with a p-value of 0.08, which is statistically not significant. Coming to discussion, I would like to invite Dr. Shashilata Kabra ma'am to go forward with it.
Good afternoon, everyone. PCOS is a combination of chronic anovulation or oligomenorrhea and biochemical or clinical hyperandrogenism and ovarian polycystic changes observed by ultrasound and affects about 6 to 8% population. Elevated levels of luteinizing hormone and subsequent influences on the thecal compartment of ovary may play an additional role in the establishment of clinically apparent hyperandrogenism. Determination of serum PSA levels was offered as a means of providing an additional diagnostic benefit by a few researchers. In a study, a PSA level greater than 10 picogram per ml was shown to provide sensitivity and specificity of 85% and 80% respectively in women with anovulatory PCOS. So this is the analysis of different studies, and those studies which are marked gray and black, they have done respectively in 2006, 7, 9, 11, and they had a p-value of PSA difference which was significant, and they have showed that PSA is increased in PCOS. And then there is another study by Atkin Tokmak in 2017. They did not find any significance. And in our study, which was completed in 2020, again, there was no significance, p-value was high. And this chart shows the correlation between total PSA with other parameters in PCOS subject. And here we have seen an inverse relation with level of FSH. R value was 0.41. So in the present study, correlation analysis identified an inverse correlation between FSH and total PSA levels with R value 0.41 and P value between the two groups less than 0.01, which is statistically significant. And the study which I've shown you earlier, in which Gural et al. Clearly demonstrated positive correlations between PSA, Perriman-Gallaway score, LH-FSH ratio, total testosterone, DHEAS, and sex hormone binding globally. And another study which I have shown, Unking et al. Demonstrated PSA and free PSA levels are positively correlated with androgens and estrogen. And there was another study, Mardanian F et al., which also showed positively correlated PSA levels in PCOS with LH-FSH ratio, total testosterone, Perriman-Gallaway score, and DHEAS. So our results showed that total serum levels of PSA were not a diagnostic marker of PCOS. However, lack of association between PSA levels and hyperandrogenemia is likely attributable to the relative physiological immaturity of PSA producing tissues in the breast of adolescent girls. PCOS presents with varied symptoms, and thus a single diagnostic algorithm can't be followed. So to conclude, the present study, which was done in Indian population, says that there is no difference in the serum level of PSA with or without PCOS. It was noted that serum levels of total PSA do not provide any diagnostic gain over conventional criteria of PCOS. There is an inverse correlation between follicle stimulating hormone and total PSA level in PCOS groups. But further Indian studies are required to arrive at any conclusion, and we require many randomized large controlled trials for further consistent results. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Monica. It was a very good presentation, and thank you to all the DDU team for an excellent presentation. Now for this today's meeting, I hope I'm audible.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah, you're audible, Renu.
Okay, thank you. So now I invite judges for today's meet. We have Dr. Vijay Jutshi, Dr. Leena Wadhwa, and Dr. Surveen. They all have already joined. I think now they can ask questions in case they have any questions to ask from the presenters.
Yes, from the
Hi, Renu, can you hear me? Renu, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Dr. Jutshi, very well. Thanks for coming. Thank you.
No. Actually, I'm outside, so I thought कि पीछे क्या आवाजें आ रही हैं. No, I had very excellent presentations by Dr. Monica, and congratulations to DDU Hospital.
Thank you so much.
I think in COVID, there are not many questions. We all know how it has hit us badly. The only comment I have to make for the second presentation, that it is not that uncommon that I always tell the people who work with me that you should always over-diagnose tuberculosis. I have seen two patients where we had the same kind of a story, and she was previous to cesarean. That means she has had cesareans earlier and nothing was found at that time. Then she developed it de novo later on, probably because of the immunocompromised condition, as pointed out rightly. So one should be over-diagnosing. I totally agree with you. And correctly, you have taken a biopsy. That should be the dictum. And nothing else is in your mind, take a biopsy, and that is going to clinch the diagnosis. And nothing else has to be done for that.
Yes, ma'am. I do agree because.
And coming to the third. Yeah, carry on.
Yes, ma'am. Usually we see the cases in early pregnancy. This is rarely we see a patient of term pregnancy, like the patient presenting with a pyoperitoneum. So TB is such an endemic disease. We have to keep in mind always.
I have seen two patients. No, I have seen two patients, and they were previous to cesarean. One of them. So surprisingly, at the time of cesarean also previous, nothing would have been there, probably. So that is why it has been over later on. Probably it was not reported, but then definitely we have seen. And coming to the last presentation, I think this is something which is evolving every day. The more you do, the less you know about the disease. I think let's hope that we have another new investigation which may eventually help us in prognosticating the patient and maybe diagnose it in early in youngsters who are coming quite regularly. Thank you all. Then we can, Lena, I can see Lena. Lena can ask if she has any query.
Yes, Madam, it was congratulations to DDU team. It was a very good presentation. From the first speaker, I would like to just know about the details. That out of 46 cases, 11 patients were admitted to ICU and 10 died.
Yes,
So,
ma'am.
Can you just tell us what was the main cause of mortality?
Ma'am, mostly it was COVID-related viral pneumonia, which was either complicated by sepsis or multi-organ dysfunction. So most of the cases died of SARI, sudden acute respiratory injury, ma'am.
Okay, okay, fine.
I think it has been well reported that once they get a pneumonia, pregnancy, all the literature is showing that they behave quite badly vis-a-vis non-pregnant women. This is quite well reported. So that is why you have such a high mortality in that group. Definitely.
And in the second, I agree with Dr. Jutchi that tuberculosis is to be overdiagnosed, and sometimes we even get cases with flare up after few days of cesarean section also. Although in this case it was diagnosed along with it. And third case, obviously, PSA is coming up in trial basis in PCOS. Thank you for the kind presentation. Thank you.
At the outset, let me congratulate DDU for these wonderful presentations, Dr. Monica and her team. So basically, the ones who died in the first presentation, were there any comorbidities with these women?
Ma'am, I mentioned in my slides, hypertensive disorder of pregnancy was there in a few of them, but not all of them, ma'am. In 3 of them, they had hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, ma'am.
Severe hypertensive disorders.
Yes, ma'am.
That led to the death.
And when we compared the 2 waves, ma'am, this was found statistically significant also, the increased number of hypertensive disorders of pregnancy in the second wave.
And no diabetes was there in any of them?
There was, it was not like if we compare the group which recovered and vis-a-vis the group which expired, it was not that the diabetes, we found a statistically significant association in that group. I mean, obviously, I mentioned that the cases of diabetes and GDM were higher in the second wave, but when we compare the 2 groups of mortality versus recovered, it was not like that, ma'am. But we found this association with hypertensive disorders.
So comorbidities was really not too much of a cause for the death, I would say, right?
Ma'am, but like pre-existing sugar derangement or hypertension, they predispose a patient to a more severe form of COVID.
No, I'm saying in your cases, there was not too much comorbidity.
Yes, ma'am.
And they were fairly young also.
Yes, ma'am. Most of the patients presenting between 25 to 30 age group, ma'am.
And thank you. And the second case, pyoperitoneum, I would just like to ask that was there any previous history of difficulty in conception? Was this tuberculosis present beforehand? Did it appear in
even after the diagnosis, after the pus was seen, we retrospectively asked from the patient, there is no such history in the patient or in any of the family.
So that means the tuberculosis actually started and became pyoperitoneum during that pregnancy itself.
Yes, ma'am. Because the patient has routine antenatal checkup and the previous scan also not showing any pus. The patient has a scan at 21 weeks, 28 weeks, and no scan was showing pyoperitoneum.
And during pregnancy, it never developed low-grade fever or anything?
Ma'am, I think the patient is not giving the history. But maybe because she is having low-grade and she may relate it to the pregnancy symptoms or malaise, because all these patients belong to a lower socioeconomic status, so she have not recorded it maybe. So, but she is not giving history.
How fast did she conceive after her last?
3 years. 3 years. He's married for 3 years.
And she never used contraception.
No, she never used contraception.
So she could have some element of tuberculosis
Maybe.
there, because 3 years without contraception, not conceiving, there could be some element there. And
Surveen, you will always think of infertility.
yes,
I'm telling you that I've seen a patient of 2 patients who had previous 2 cesarean sections, deliveries, full-term deliveries, and third time she had a pyoperitoneum, and one was previous 1 cesarean. So it is something inherent to do with the pregnancy, probably immunosuppression, and then they get into this infection.
I think my postnatal advice to this patient would be that please have your second baby fast, because probably her tubes are going to go.
नहीं तो फिर सुरवीन के पास जाना पड़ेगा.
And of course, the third case was actually very unique and new. And I think we need a lot more research on it before we can comment. But it was a commendable effort to pick up this topic and take it and analyze it. I think Dr. Shashi really did a very, very good job of it. And it has probably raised this thing that we need some further research, and maybe we could give another topic of research on this basis. But at the end of it, what is your conclusion? You have reviewed the literature. Do you feel that there is a solid connection between PCOS and PSA, or is it just like...
Ma'am, I have analyzed so many studies.
Yes.
So around 60% of studies, it was seen that there is a correlation and the levels are higher in patients suffering from androgenemia and PCOS. But in our Indian study, it was not seen. There is another Indian study which was published in 2020 by Karnataka. They have shown a significance and p-value significance. That means PSA can be a diagnostic marker. But that was a study of 60 cases. Ours was of 40 cases. So I think that we have a lot of, diabetes has become so common in our country, and PCOD too has become very common in recent 10-15 years. So I think that larger studies are required, and definitely we will come out to a conclusion. And still there is a possibility that this may become a marker, diagnostic marker later on. But we need a larger study.
So, my one question to you is that do you think it is a diagnostic marker, or both diagnostic as well as prognostic?
It can be a prognostic marker for androgenism also.
No, because, and I think it might, again, Dr. Zuchi will say she's getting infertility, but I think it might just become a marker for fertility also for us at some stage. How good will our embryos be with a PSA which is high, which already we say where there are androgens are high, how good or bad it is. So I think there's a lot of research needed into this. Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you all the judges for your contribution to this nice meeting. Thank you very much for being here and making this meeting very interactive. Now over to Dr. Rekha Bharti for proceeding with the...
Before Rekha takes over, I think it was a very good presentation from DDU. And I can see Dr. Swaraj Batra, Dr. Renuka Sinha in the audience. So if they would want to ask something and give a comment, I would ask Shivam to unmute them. Shivam, Dr. Renuka Sinha and Dr. Suraj Batra are there in the audience. Can you see them? Shivam? Shivam?
Yes, ma'am.
ये तुम्हारे यहाँ से आवाजें आ रही थी?
No, ma'am. Dr. Vijay.
अच्छा ये डॉक्टर स्वराज बत्रा और डॉक्टर रेणुका सिन्हा अगर हैं तो उनको अनम्यूट कर दो.
Yes, ma'am. Dr. Swaraj is here. Dr. Renuka not, ma'am.
ठीक है, डॉक्टर स्वराज को अनम्यूट कर दो और उनको वीडियो ऑन करा दो. डॉक्टर, गुड इवनिंग मैडम.
No comments. No comments. Good evening.
Good evening, ma'am. It's good to see you in our meetings, So I thought everybody should meet you. Okay. Thank you, madam, for being there. Rekha, over to you.
Yeah. So welcome to the next session of the AOGD meeting. So we are going to start a quiz which is based on the September issue of AOGD bulletin, and this was based on urogynecology. So those who have been participating in the quiz, they all know that to participate, like we'll provide you a pin which will be displayed on your screen. So you can keep the pin copied with you. Otherwise, I'll be announcing the pin again. You have provided a link in your chat box. This is quiz is on Kahoot platform. So kahoot.it is a link which is provided in the chat box. So what you have to do is just click on this link and then you have to type the pin. So I'll be announcing the pin, or you can copy it because Shivam will be displaying it on your screens also. And then you'll be asked to enter the nickname. So this nickname will be